culture, cultural studies, visual culture, critical theory, and gender and sexuality. She's the author of 3 books, Elizabeth Bowen, A Reputation in Writing, published in 1994, Lesbian Configurations, published in 1997, and she has recently finished a book manuscript entitled A Violent Embrace, Arts and Aesthetics After Representation, and that's forthcoming with the University Press of New England. In addition to her intra-departmental functions, Renée serves as a member of the Academic Senate, the class faculty council, and was a member of the Humanities Center Advisory Board. She also initiated and leads an interdepartmental visual culture working group at Wayne State University, and is the director of the 5th Annual Conference of the Association for the Study of the Arts in the Present. Last summer, she also accepted the editorship of the journal Criticism. She's currently organizing the annual conference of the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present, which is coming to Wayne State University in Detroit in October this year, under the banner of the Arts of the City. She has involved herself in the programs of the Humanities Center, of course, and said she was a member of our advisory board. This is her 2nd Brownback talk, and she was also presented at our 2010 Fall Symposium on Bildung, a concept that she introduced to the Center's advisory board. She also moderated one of the sessions of our 2010 Faculty Fellows Conference on Gender and Sexuality, and also volunteered to moderate a session of our recent conference on the apocalyptic imagination. So here is an engaged scholar and a determined scholar who made sure that her PowerPoint worked in spite of the initial problem. So please welcome to the podium my friend and colleague, Renée Hoogland, who's going to talk to you today about queer becoming, art, affect, and the dissolution of being human.
Thank you, Walter. After keeping you waiting for like 20 minutes to get this all set up, I feel even more bad about the way in which this paper actually works. Because I wrote this paper for a conference that was organized last spring, I think, in Milwaukee by the Center for 21st Century Studies on the non-human turn. And let me begin by doing something rather annoying and change my title, as it appears on the flyer, overly long and marred by diacritical affectation as it is, and call this talk Unbecoming Queer Becoming, Was My Red Wool Sweater That Made Me Gay. Because it is true. It was my red wool sweater that made me gay. I'm serious. There was, of course, nothing gay about this sweater, nor was there, I assume, anything gay about me at age 3. And here I am in my red wool sweater at age 3. At least not in the all but exclusively sexual sense, I can read it, in which the term gay is commonly understood and primarily understandable today, a sense in which it was, needless to say, entirely unknown to my pre-Stonewall toddler self. But this sweater, the act of wearing it and the sensation of the wearing of it, did something to me, made me feel something that I clearly remember as somehow exciting, producing a tension that was undeniably physical, but also more, or rather other than that, something closer to a mood, or a mode of being, an affective state that I would, in due course, in my more narrowly defined sexually affective encounters, come to recognize as decidedly queer. So that when people ask me when I first knew I was gay, a question that I need not remind you, straight identified humans are never expected to be able to answer about their epistemological, ontological origins. My first association is not with the kindergarten teacher I was secretly in love with, or with the next door neighbor whom my mother told me had something creepy about her, and though remaining undefined, I kind of sensed what this creepiness was all about, and that it somehow also had to do with me, nor even with the books that I, a few years later, furtively took out of the library, and that provided me with a rather terrifying vocabulary for my unmentionable feelings and sensations. No, neither are the humans, whether as objects of desire or disgust, nor symbolic language or discursive spaces evoke my sense of primary emergence on the scene of meaning and being. But instead, the first thing that comes to mind is unexceptionally my red wool sweater. In its very tactility, its smell, its color, its timbre, its sonorous materiality. My encounters over time with my red wool sweater, in retrospect, has taught me something significant about the materiality, the contingency, the affect-laden nature of the assembled/assembling phenomenon of being, or of becoming generally, and about that of unbecoming, queer becoming in particular. I'm claiming a certain specificity for non-heterosexual modes of embodied becoming, first, because unlike any other form of minority identification, such as gender, race, and ethnicity, sexuality, or more particularly non-heterosexualities, traditionally have been and continue to be defined, pace Foucault, in terms of doing rather than being something. That is to say, in terms of sexual practices, and not in relation to corporeal aspects that are commonly assumed to maintain their ontological stability, such as skin color, the presence or absence of certain body parts, or the shape of the nose, lips, types of hair. The term heterosexuality, of course, also implies certain corporeal practices, but the being of being heterosexual is neither exhausted nor all but exclusively determined by such bodily behaviors. The pervasive influence of post-structuralism, the widening range of biomedical technological interventions on the level of the flesh, and the overall increased tolerance for sexual diversity notwithstanding, there continues to be something unquestionable and unquestionably natural about the being heterosexual. To put it in oversimplified terms, in everyday life, heterosexuals are, non-heterosexuals become. Such resistance to denaturalization is adequately reflected in the fact that the only common alternative term for heterosexuality is being straight, while its counterpart, since the first known appearance of the term homosexual in an 1868 letter by Carlo Maria Chiappini, and the term lesbian with its modern meaning in a 1732 book by William King, range from triad, fricotess, sodomite to sapphist, pederast, burning, third sex, intersexual, and homophile, to current acronyms like LGBT or LGBTQ, or simply the equally protean queer. There is just something unfinalized, if not unfinalizable, about queer becoming, which is always at the same time a form of unbecoming. Second, non-heterosexualities, precisely of their perceptual and in effect physical and physiological elusiveness, in the sense that you cannot tell from the outside if somebody is gay, nor has the ongoing search for specific homosexual body parts, for instance, a lesbian finger or a gay gene, produced any satisfactory, let alone conclusive evidence for their cause, or their existence within prevailing frameworks of medical scientific thought. Such non-normative sexualities have thus traditionally been marked and marked themselves off, not only through behavioral practices, but also through things, objects, materiality. This includes inanimate objects or non-human animals. It is a well-known fact, for example, that all lesbians love cats, while gay men favor small lapdogs like chihuahuas, pugs, and poodles. Lesbians also have strong emotional connections with horses, and as far as activities are concerned, love to play softball and field hockey, while gay men outside of the gym prefer to invest their time in figure skating, rollerblading, as well as listening to opera and musicals. I'm not listing these admittedly stereotypical aspects of contemporary gay and lesbian existence to poke fun at the surprisingly large numbers of so-called normal people who believe they are true. Nor do I wish to call them into question as politically incorrect, hence morally objectionable, or at least not in the sense in which such repudiations tend to be articulated. What I'm trying to draw attention to is that becoming non-heterosexually, both epistemologically and ontologically, is, first of all, a radically historical process. No softball games, but fencing and hunting, and no Birkenstocks. But, hang on now, I lost my place. No Birkenstocks, but a sophisticated masculine wardrobe marked Radcliffe Hall's quintessential managed lesbian Stephen Gordon off as a pervert in the 1920s. but also an undeniably materially embodied and embedded phenomenon within an ever-emergent system of linkages with material objects and practices, a becoming through multiplicity, an intensity of becoming, in which what comes to pass is whatever comes into play between singularities at any given moment. That this, at least theoretically, equally holds true for dominant or straight modulations of becoming is nothing to detract from the fact that it is in its material practices, manifestations, and effects that the latter, heterosexuality, appears and thus obtains as a form of natural or transcendent being, while the former, queer becoming, primarily consists in activity, in what Alfred North Whitehead calls actual or living occasions, or what Deleuze and Guattari describe as intensive events within complex matrices of materiality. Seen in this light, the idea of the closet in relation to queer sexualities may actually not be suggestive so much of cultural silencing or refer to an area of unarticulated secrets, but instead point to the liminal state of emergence that happens in the encounter, a moment of bringing forth, a poietic moment in a Heideggerian sense, in which two entities, in my own primal seeing that between me and my red wool sweater, co-produce one another in a unique and singular occasion that leaves neither entity unaffected, that transforms them both and creates something new that wasn't there before. Heidegger writes, quote, "Bringing forth brings out of concealment into unconcealment." Yet, as marked by his use of the original German verb veranlassen, meaning to set something going or to start something on its way, bringing forth is always processual, never final. Coming out of the closet, then, would be an occasion that suggests something emergent, something arriving on the scene, a moment, or better, many such moments, that do not mark a definitive, irreversible coming into being as a gay or lesbian person, but literally a contingent process of re or indirection, of moving away from one assemblage, a certain plane of consistency, into and onto another. In short, of queering as a verb, as an activity of simultaneous becoming and unbecoming. In view of their necessarily profoundly ambivalent investments in the law of meaning and being, it's not surprising that lesbian feminists have developed the most radically anti-foundationalist accounts of such unbecoming becomings. Judith Butler famously defines both gender and sexual identities in terms of performativity as ontological illusions whose success depends on the reiteration of a certain stylization of the body, of doing one's body in a particular way, to project a stabilized play at being something or other. A Foucauldian definition that entails the possibility for undoing, for playing at being anything at all, differently. Assuming a largely psychoanalytic perspective, Teresa de la Redes equally tries to explain the material, corporeal reconfiguration of straightforward human beings into the spectral ontology of the lesbian in terms of practice, primarily the practice of love, a process of bodily transfiguration she imagines with reference to Bourdieu as a series of habit changes obtaining on the level of the Freudian multi-componential instinct. Such attempts at queering the law of sexual naturalization opened the way for a radical deterritorializing project of sexual, if not ontological, dissolution. I nonetheless find them unsatisfying, and not only because the word queer, used as an adverb or noun, rather than as a verb, seems to have lost most, if not all, of its potentially deregulating power. But also because Butler's Foucauldian Althuserian model of gender and sexual inscription ultimately renders the gay male subject into an object of prohibition, while the lesbian is reduced to the space of the abject. De la Redes, duly foregrounding the function of the constitutive outside, that is to say, the world as such and whatever is in it, in effecting a reconfiguration of being at the most elusive, extra-symbolic level of the instinct, both assumes a subject that pre-exists its transforming encounters with the world and offers a model of lesbian being that remains, in the final analysis, intra- or intersubjective in nature. Both models, albeit in different ways, thus at once preclude an alternative mode of non-normative sexual becoming, one that is capable of accommodating the formative, or indeed the transformative force of actual embodied experience, and they obscure the poietic operation of non-human and non-animate objects and things in the corporeal, material practice of queer becoming. In brief, in queer experience as occasion or event qua activity. In response, I submit that it is this emergence of affect theory in tandem with the various new materialisms and new vitalisms that have become the center of debates in recent months, which at once inscribe the centrality of queer becoming in the current critical focus on the non-human generally, and which more specifically offer possibilities for pursuing a much more radical project of unbecoming ontological affirmation than either a Foucauldian or a neo-Freudian or neo-Lacanian approach allows. As my use of the words encounter, occasion, and event with respect to what I've so far said about unbecoming queer indicates, I take my cue here more from affect theory and more specifically from Deleuzian and Whiteheadian trends of thought than from certain new materialisms and new vitalisms. This is partly because I believe, with Steve Shaviro, that experientiality and affectivity are more accommodating categories and in effect more primary modalities than the notions of vitality and or materiality can suggest about experience in the process of its actualization in its eventness. Partly also, and here I must briefly return to the confessional mode in which I began, because in the course of my readings in recent months on the non-human turn, I found myself increasingly wary of some of the more broad-ranging claims made in the name of this new ontology, with its focus on the inventive capacities ascribed to materiality itself. This may well be because I'm neither a philosopher nor a political theorist, but indeed what is still generally known as a humanist, while altogether congruent with the lessons that I too have learned from, say, new body theory, complexity and systems theory, and not to forget affect theory, or even so-called neo-aesthetics. I remain somewhat skeptical about the presumed ethical and political sweep of the new materialist framework, and its role in enabling what some imagine to be the creativity and freedom, and others an affirmative ethics and citizenship on a global scale. And I quote these two phrases from Diana Coole's and Samantha Frost's introduction to New Materialism's Ontology, Agency, and Politics, published in 2012. As a radical empiricist, and perhaps somewhat of a speculative one as well, not so much by default as on account of my experience of and in the world as what the limitations of language force me awkwardly to define queerly positioned, I am primarily concerned with what actually happens with concepts and ideas, how they work, what they do, and not so much in what they are, where they're coming from, or what their as yet unactualized potential might be. This means that my main interest in this paper, and in a non-human term more generally, is the linkages, the conceptual assemblages, if you will, that the various new materialisms and neo-vitalisms enable, or have already forged with a queer project that, according to some, has lost its revolutionary momentum, if it's not factually already over. Philosophy, Deleuze maintains in his 1988 conversation with Raymond Bellour and François Ewald, is, quote, always creating new concepts. The only constraint is that they should have a necessity as well as an unfamiliarity, and that they have both to the extent that they're a response to real problems. In this sense, the non-human term offers itself as a potentially productive moment to a queer project that, I would argue, in its profoundly anti-foundationalist, anti-essentialist, and critical materialist orientation, at once anticipated this turn in critical theorizing, and that has run into real problems, in that it has failed to follow through its promise of a non-humanistic, non-personal, non-subjective ontology, partly because queer has been largely domesticated as an identificatory term and thus divested of its more radical conceptual potential, partly because the queer theoretical project itself has gotten stuck in the negative sway of certain of the post-structuralisms in the context of which it first emerged. In other words, if queer theory initially appeared to project a dissolution of the subject per se, of an unbecoming human, it has, it seems, found its main potentiality in the ability to say no to dominant frames of psychosocial subjectivation, in what Georgia Agamben describes as the impotentiality of being able to not do. The, on the contrary, affirmative assumptions underlying most of the neo-materialisms and new vitalisms provide productive opportunities to think through and perhaps actualize a queer potentiality as distinct from its impotentiality that I, for one, am not quite ready or willing to give up on. Yet, there is also a sense in which I think a specifically queer non-human term may offer something more, which is, in effect, the same as to say something less than the somewhat grandiose models of a new ethical world order in which creativity and freedom reign from within a new materialist framework. As previously suggested, and as my not quite unserious presentation of gay and lesbian existence in terms of things, objects, and material practices has hopefully illuminated, the concept of an active materiality necessarily incorporates both sensual, perceptual, and affective dimensions. As Deleuze pursues his meditations on philosophy in the conversation mentioned a moment ago, quote, concepts involve two other dimensions, percepts and affects. Percepts aren't perceptions, they're packets of sensations and relations that live on independently of whoever experiences them. Affects aren't feelings, they're becomings that spill over beyond whoever lives through them, thereby becoming someone else, end quote. As a materially based, embodied and embedded practice, as essential perceptual activity, queer, or for that matter, any form of sexuality, I'd argue, is neither a natural state of being nor a consciously adopted mode of giving expression to a pre-existing self, but a complex, processual, contingent, and provisional affair that may or may not, over time, produce its own claim of consistency. And while I finish the talk, I will show you some of my own curiosities. As such, it is both largely unconscious, for obtaining primarily on the level of the body, and in the first place an affective phenomenon, since within a still overwhelmingly phallogocentric and heteronormative social symbolic order, the material practice of queer becoming inevitably entails a sustained activity of unbecoming, of becoming someone or something else. It is such unbecoming moments that perhaps provide the unusual circumstances under which it is possible to become conscious of this otherwise largely unconscious perceptual, sensual, and affective process. This brings me to my final point, that is to say, my prioritizing of a Whiteheadian, Deleuzian notion of affect instead of pursuing a purely materialist or neo-vitalist approach to the questions of a non-human ontology. In the context of his critique of pure feeling, Whitehead, we recall, posits emotion as the basis of experience, in which the subject-object relation is foundational. Whereas objects or entities in a way are given for Whitehead, in the sense that the object or datum is describable without reference to its being caught up in subjective apprehension, the subject is not. The subject doesn't pre-exist the occasion of its experience, but rather constitutes it. Quote, an occasion is a subject in respect of its special activity concerning an object, and anything is an object in respect to its provocation of some special activity within a subject, end quote. It is this kind of activity that Whitehead calls apprehension. And what is key in Whitehead's recasting of the subject-object relation as a fundamental structure of experience is the notion of concern, which has nothing to do with knowledge or understanding, but which constitutes, quote, the affective tone drawn from the object and directed towards it, end quote. This is what Whitehead calls, Whitehead defines, as the subjective form. Both the idea of the occasion, which is the subject, as a special activity that is provoked by an object, whose relevance provokes the origination of the very prehension that constitutes the experience, and the subject of the experience itself, allow us to do, in my view, two critical things. First, it encourages us to see affect as a force that is both impersonal and material, but that yet accommodates the possibility of differentiated provocations and effective investments. That is to say, to somehow account for the fact that I do not experience either the world or myself as some form of massive active materiality, but that some objects or data within this materiality concern me more, affect me more than others, and that the manner of my experience of them constitutes itself depending on its complex of subjective forms. The ontological question of, say, queer becoming is thus neither a question of origins nor of cause and effect in the traditional metaphysical sense, but a question of affective modulation. Put more simply, the question is not what or why, but how. Second, if we accept that the basis of all experience is emotion, Whitehead's critique of pure feeling doesn't provide us with an ethics nor with a politics, but instead with an aesthetics of existence, to which I would add that such an aesthetics is never not political. Thus, it is in the aftermath of the cultural turn and in the context of a materialist, vitalist, and non-human ontological turn that we can, somewhat paradoxically perhaps, posit aesthetics as a first philosophy. Now I'm obviously running out of time, yet I know that in my abstract I promise to pursue an argument on the operation of art as a privileged site or force field of non-human and human deterritorialization. This argument will have to wait for another occasion, for I have once again found myself distracted, as in being diverted, sidetracked, or drawn away from the straight path, this time from that of proper scholarly pursuit, by my intense concern for my red wool sweater and its untimely, unbecoming operations, albeit in its actual virtual rather than its olfactory, tactile, and material manifestations.
Well, we have time for questions and comments. And silent adoration.
Oh, well, I might as well sit down.
Comments, contributions. You have one.
It was a nice presentation.
Thank you.
Very well.
You see, I needed the images, right?
Renee,
Okay.
the images came in late. Sorry, I have to be in another interesting space. The images, are those yours or those are they ones you selected or?
The final series, you
Yes.
mean? Those are my own. So there are like objects from my house, from my life, companions in my life.
Yeah, really interesting the way it tilts the perspective and brings you right into, I don't know, brings you into the interior space in a really, really unique and profound way. And I saw some patterns there which I thought were sending messages that basically indicated a non-conformity to the way that convention usually likes to frame things.
Right.
The side angles, and I really like the feet.
My shoes, yes.
Shoes,
My
and
favorite
then
shoes.
And the socks.
Right. Well, that is actually my point, right? We do have like an effective relationship with the clothes that we wear, and we all know that we feel different, that we feel our bodies different. We do our bodies differently depending on whether we're wearing heels or sneakers, for instance, right? And we kind of like totally kind of ignore that the way in which we feel determines how we present ourselves to the world, but also to ourselves. So I wanted to kind of draw out these kind of like ostensibly totally kind of like, you know, trivial aspects of, but they're not trivial for us. They're not trivial for the way in which we feel or feel our way through the course of our everyday lives. For instance, you know, when we arrive at a party, we're totally underdressed, or overdressed is worse, actually. Underdressed you can get away with, but overdressed you feel totally uncomfortable, right? So that totally determines who you can be, the ways in which you can actualize yourself, which is no longer the self that you came in with, right? And that's kind of like the point why I wanted to have all these different kind of objects that appear to be like totally unrelated to what I'm talking about. But, yes.
So it seems to me that we're looking at the formation of a queer ontology, maybe, and in that it seems like there's this need for performativity as it informs that ontology.
Well, then we actually we land back with Butler, right? And Butler does, even though she questions the possibility of subjectivity as such, right? there is a kind of inescapability to her notion of performativity, and it kind of sneakily presupposes a subject that pre-exists the iterations of certain forms of stylizations of the body. Even though she kind of says she's not doing it, but since she kind of remains within a post-structuralist framework, deconstructive framework, she can't really escape from the idea that there is a subject that is inscribed, but that hence inscribed in socio-symbolic frameworks, but at the same time that presupposes a subject that already exists, right? In order for something to be inscribed into something else, it has to exist first. And that's my problem with it, kind of like philosophically. It doesn't really work that way, and that's why I think, you know, and I'm very grateful to Steve for kind of like introducing me to Whitehead. The Whitehead's notion of like the subject doesn't pre-exist anything at all. It only comes into being and then only kind of like in a contingent way in what the Lewis would call like a moment of actualization, or a kind of like intense connection, a moment of intensity during an occasion or event, when you kind of encounter the linkages, the flows, like, you know, all those kind of Deleuzian words. But that doesn't mean, and this is perhaps why the term dissolution was perhaps, you know, it's a little bit stark, right? We don't like all want to kind of like totally dissolve into nothingness, but I think we need a very kind of strong term in order to move beyond the notion of denaturalization per se, because that kind of remains, again, embedded in a traditional metaphysics that assumes that there is such a thing as nature and something that is natural. Right? I don't know whether that kind of answers your question.
In part it does. I was going to ask, well, you brought up in a lot of other questions, but I was going to ask you to sort of speak a little bit about how your investigation is contextualized by Deleuze and Guattari, which is sort of
It is. It's very much important.
And then I want to just throw a weird sort of thing out there. I know Dr. Reich wants to ask a question, but I'm interested in this idea of, I think I get the problem with Butler, if we're going to call it that. But could we look at sort of performativity, other aspects of performativity, such as what I call mise en scène, which you seem to, which I totally dig. You seem to emphasize that in the development of an aesthetic, perhaps
Right.
a queer aesthetic.
Right.
So I kind of just threw back two weird things at you. You can do with
Yeah,
what
I
you
mean,
may.
when I, you know, the kind of the reason why I showed these various kind of different forms of materiality, like in the last series of slides from my own life, like what you kind of like could kind of see, and I was looking at the images because I put this together like last year for the conference, and then today I would actually have used different images again. So the kind of like that plane of consistency, maybe a plane of consistency, but it's not solid, it's not fixed once and for all. It is never to be finalized, and that's the kind of like the air that I breathe. Getting away from Butler's notion of performativity, because it does open up space for, well, you know, if you kind of accept that life is a messy space, it's also an open place, right, or vice versa. And it's like, I think that is what appeals to me and what kind of I find much more enabling than, although it's like kind of hilarious to kind of, when you kind of just Google queer stuff, you get all these things, all these kind of like paraphernalia that we all recognize as queer, which is weird, right, in and of itself. But that kind of suggests how even Butler's, in the 1990s, very radical ideas about queer performativity have become stabilized and have become solidified as identificatory terms rather than, you know, in terms of the kind of the process of unbecoming that I'm trying to get at here.
Of course.
One of the things that I liked about, or as far as I understood it, what I liked about the way you use Whitehead to respond to Butler is that it actually seemed to me to create a much more human definition or proposal for queerness, one in which the contingent becomings are intimately connected to relationships.
For instance. Yes.
For instance.
Yeah, well,
With
relationships
objects.
to everything.
With everything.
Yeah.
With objects, people, places, moments. And
or
so,
ideas. I mean,
sure.
It doesn't have to be a materiality, right? I mean,
can also have an encounter with a mental object, with an idea or a thought.
What I'm struck by about that is this incredible, emotive human experience that then comes into play as an identity.
Right.
And it makes sense in the talk you're giving. I wonder how that played in a conversation on the non-human. Was
Well,
the
there were a
goal
lot
to
of
reject
old people
that?
at the conference, the object-oriented ontologists. But Richard actually asked me to write a clear paper for this conference, and I actually had a lot of fun. You may not have had, but I had a lot of fun kind of like thinking this through and talking about it. But also, what I pick up on from what you're saying, and that is an important point to me, is precisely the affirmative nature of this kind of trying to kind of think something through, rather than purely, just continuing a negative critique, which we have done for 20 years or 30 years by now, right? And it has not changed the world. So if there is, has been like a crisis in critical theory starting in the 1990s, I think this is one of the ways in which you can try to think like, okay, how we can kind of think of new ways of thinking this, or different ways of thinking this, that does not land us back into that moment where we can only say no. And that, that's the other kind of appealing aspect of this model.
So this is a kind of, I don't really know how to ask this question. It's a little bit undercooked. But so you just said that, so the way I was originally thinking of this is you characterize queer theory as coming out of a kind of anti-foundationalist, radically anti-foundationalist post-structuralist project, and that we can understand, particularly O, but as a kind of new materialisms and speculative realism, as a kind of return, an unabashed return to a kind of foundationalism, right? And in the sense that, in particular, right, the object is going to be our foundation in Harman there, and then so there are certain people in these, not everywhere, and so what I thought was really interesting is the turn towards becoming a process philosophy as a way of sort of obviating the opposition between a kind of anti-foundationalism on the one hand and a foundationalism on the other hand. But then that question sort of, the thing that I worry about losing there is the emphasis at the beginning of the talk, which I'm really sympathetic to, of the specificity of queer here over against, as a kind of non-heterosexuality. Because on some level, you could rewrite that, I worry that you could rewrite this as just Whitehead and Deleuze and lose sight of the queer aspects of this. And so I'm just, insofar as queer is operating as a kind of, it's a kind of frictional term because it seems to sort of stage this as an opposition between a foundationalism and anti-foundationalism I think is really productive. But I'm wondering where you think, what the addition of a term like queer does when you could just say Whitehead, Deleuze, and then Simon Bon would be another person I would lump in there.
Right, I think this is, I may have talked over this way too fast or not been very articulate about this. What I said at I think at the end of the paper is that in a way queer as a kind of attempt to think things differently, moving away from lesbian and gay studies, for instance, almost kind of enable the kind of turn towards the new materialism. And that's why I think indeed queer is very different from, say, race, ethnicity, gender, in the sense that queer identified people have always identified themselves through materiality, right? I remember the handkerchief, the red handkerchief. It's the boots, or the leather strappings, or it's a way in which queer has made itself manifest from the late 1960s onwards. So there is a privileged space where kind of experimentation with materialities has happened, historically speaking, and that's why I thought it would be kind of interesting to think that, because of course we can't just all of a sudden kind of live in a utopian society where nobody is, right? Because we're expected to be. right? Even if we have to kind of choose which bathroom, public bathroom to use, we have to identify ourselves in gender terms. If we don't have a passport which marks our gender, we don't exist before the law. So it's like not in the sense that, all of a sudden we can overturn the world of meaning and being. That's what we live in. But to try and think from an affirmative kind of position, maybe disrupt rather than just kind of produce alternative spaces or alternative modulations of becoming, I think, is still an important political project. And I think queer is a specifically kind of, a privileged site from which to start both doing and thinking. If that is kind of like my undercooked answer to your undercooked question.
Raw food here.
Well,
Right. Well,